Welcome back to How to Change the World, the podcast that equips changemakers with the insights, tools, and inspiration to drive meaningful impact. I am Catherine Alonso. One of the conditions of our current world that absolutely fascinates me is the declining trust in traditional institutions. Gallup surveys show that public confidence in government, big business, and the media is historically low. When people lose trust, they also lose certainty about who is responsible for solving the challenges around us. So I recently surveyed my community and asked them, who do you think is responsible for driving responses to social problems, to the things that we face? The results were fascinating, absolutely fascinating. There was not a lot of consensus about which institutions hold the most power or who has the most responsibility for responding to social change. But one thing was really, really clear, that people think that there is a lot of opportunity for collaboration amongst institutions that we are really not making the most of. Business, government, nonprofits, community groups, individuals, none of us can shoulder this alone, and we each have a unique role to play. By the way, you can find out more about that report on my website, catherinealonso.com. That truth, though, that we are all in this together and all different kinds of institutions play a role in responding to the problems we face, sits at the center of this week's episode. My guests argue in a new book called Capital Evolution that we are entering a new capitalist era. They call it dynamic capitalism, and it's a system in which business plays a much bigger role in shaping society. They contrast that with the neoliberal capitalist society that we really have been living in for the last 50 years or more. So today we're exploring the big questions. If business is stepping forward as a central actor in our economy, how do we ensure accountability? How do values, not just profit, guide leadership? And how does this change the partnership between business, government, and communities when it comes to responding to the problems that we face? To help us make sense of this moment, I'm joined today by Elizabeth MacBride and Seth Levine, the authors of a brand new book, which is out now, Capital Evolution, The New American Economy. Elizabeth MacBride is a journalist, author, and entrepreneur whose reporting on finance, innovation, and global economic change has reached millions. Her work has helped reshape how policymakers understand entrepreneurship, and she has reported from everywhere, from Silicon Valley to conflict zones around the world. And Seth Levine is a longtime venture capitalist and partner at Foundry, a firm he co-founded that now manages nearly $4 billion in assets. He has advised entrepreneurs and policymakers globally, and he co-founded Pledge 1%, which is a network of companies committed to giving back to their communities. Together, Elizabeth and Seth have interviewed leaders from JP Morgan, KKR, PayPal, Time Warner, and so many other businesses, uncovering a transformation that could really redefine what capitalism looks like in the next decade and beyond. I'm so excited to dig in with you. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Elizabeth MacBride and Seth Levine. Seth Levine and Elizabeth MacBride, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be here.
Thanks, Catherine.
So let's jump right in. You have a new book coming out, your second that you've written together, and it is called Capital Evolution, The New American Economy. So tell me a little bit about how capital evolution is defined and what makes the moment we're in now fundamentally different from anything that's come before.
Yeah. So great way to frame really the entire book, because the whole book basically describes the last 50 years of capitalism in the United States. The start of it was marked by Milton Friedman. When he came out, he had a book first, but the popular version of his thinking came out in an article in the New York Times in 1970. It described that the only purpose of a corporation was to make profits for its shareholders. And that became entrenched, particularly in the 80s, in our sort of economic thought. Both Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan, very famously here in the US, were strong proponents of this sort of Friedman we could call it neoliberal worldview, and it kind of took over. And really, for probably most people listening to this podcast, it's kind of the only form of capitalism we've ever really thought about, right? It's been around for 50 plus years, but of course, it's had some challenges. And while the United States, as an overall economy, has done reasonably well under this form of capitalism. We suffer from the sort of like the Jeff Bezos joke problem. Like Jeff Bezos walks into a bar of 100 people and the average person's a billionaire. Tells you absolutely nothing about the people in the bar, right? And so what's happened in our economy is that we've become very concentrated in terms of wealth and in terms of opportunity. We'll, I'm sure, talk later about sort of the decreasing dynamism in the United States economy these days. And we've become sort of politically fractious because of that, right? It's created instability. And really what we describe in the book is that we're sort of in this like neoliberal age maybe kind of ended at, half dozen years ago or so. And we're kind of in this messy middle, and it's not clear entirely where we're headed. But we have an idea for where that might be, and we describe it as dynamic capitalism in the book. And dynamic capitalism is still very much capitalism, right? I mean, part of it wasn't exactly as important when we started writing the book 3 years ago, but obviously today, as we're recording the very end of 2025, seems important to say that we believe capitalism is the best form of organizing an economy. And the book ends up serving as somewhat of a defense of capitalism. But it also acknowledges that the type of capitalism that we've been practicing, neoliberal capitalism, has not been effective across our economy, in particular for the middle class, and particularly for people who make a living through their wages, essentially, right? So the not the capital owners, but the labor side of the equation. So we talk about various ways in dynamic capitalism to embrace the best parts of capitalism, but also acknowledge longer term thinking versus shorter term thinking, which is a hallmark of neoliberal capitalism, which was one of its sort of big Achilles heels, actually. Empowering an ownership economy, really creating more capitalists. We want more people to participate in the market economy, more people to have a stake in the market economy. We talk about a role for government, but a limited role for government. Seems like there's and it has sort of always been a real debate about that. The neoliberals hated government. Reagan famously said government is the problem, and perhaps on the other side, they sort of embrace government as the solution to everything. We think the right answer is somewhere in the middle. So there's a role for government, but a limited role for government. And then finally, the rule of law, which seems almost crazy that we need to say it out loud, but it actually does seem here at the end of 2025 that we should acknowledge that our economic system relies upon a set of rules that we've all agreed to and the equal application of law across our country. And those are kind of the tenets of dynamic capitalism. And, it's not a foregone conclusion that that's what we will move to. It's possible we'll backtrack and we'll sort of re-engage with neoliberalism. There's certainly many people in our economy that want to do that. There obviously is a debate now. We just elected a socialist to be mayor of the largest city in the United States, the financial capital of the world. So there's how much he can really govern as a socialist is unclear. And he's not the only one, right? There's been socialist leaning people who have been governing Minneapolis, for example. DSA has had Democratic Socialists of America has had quite a lot of success in both the mayorship and the city council there. San Francisco, both of those are examples where people have pulled back a little bit. Seattle. So it seems like it's unclear where we're moving. We wanted to outline in this book an idea for where we were headed and where we thought we should head if we wanted to both continue to prosper, but also widen the economic opportunity lens.
So I find that so fascinating. Thank you for outlining that. And it sounds like one of the central parts of that forecast for the future is a reduced role of government and then an increased role of business. And that shifting role, is that within, yes, it's within a capitalist economy, but is it within, is it holistic? It's sort of a shifting role in responding to problems and figuring out and running the economy, and that really business has a bigger role than the government. Is that accurate?
Yes. What you've described is something that we recognize, and maybe it was the very first recognition in our research, is that today business is a more important strategic actor in the world and in our nation than government. and not to see that and still have your head stuck in this place that government can fix everything is just to be, I think, wildly off the mark. Because if you look at all the changes that have happened in the past decades, right, they've come really from the business sector. And if you look at what's happening now in our country, you can actually see that even when it's the government who's kind of at the surface acting, what's happening is that businesses are pushing the change, right? And so I, I'm not sure, Seth and I might disagree with this, that's not, I think, a prescription, right? We actually think that business has too much unaccountable power at this moment in time. So
Mm-hmm.
the world has shifted so that business is the biggest actor, and that's no surprise given that for 50 years, people who embrace neoliberalism have been saying government's the enemy, right? We shouldn't be surprised that government
Right.
has reduced power. So that is the reality that we're in. Given that reality, I think we need business leaders at the table to construct the institutions we need to govern the new world that we're in.
And so, what would that look? What does accountability for this more powerful, larger business entities look like?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's unclear, right? And I think,
Yeah, let's figure
part
it
of what
out.
we're describing, yeah, again, I think Elizabeth's exactly right in how she described it. Like we're describing something that isn't necessarily the world how we want it to be, it's the
Yeah.
world how it is. So now
Right.
if we acknowledge this reality, like what's there to do? And I think one of the things that we really dig into deeply in the book is sort of where's the line for businesses, right? When is a business sort of stepping over a line? In fact, it's part of why we ended up writing the book. We were challenged by some people, some CEOs asked us our opinion on what issues they should be speaking out on that sort of don't relate to their business at all. And there was a moment in time where businesses were talking about sort of everything that was popping up in our society. And we kind of stepped back and questioned whether that really makes sense, both from a societal level, is that really what we want, but also from a practical level, is that reasonable to expect from businesses? And we got some different opinions on that from different CEOs that we talked to. I think the best description of where things maybe should sit, or at least realistically can sit, came from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And we were fortunate to spend quite a bit of time with him talking about this. And, he tried to describe the difference between values. Companies should express values versus politics. I was super skeptical. I think we both were when we first heard that, because like values are politics, and where is there a line between that? We pushed him pretty hard on it. He definitely believes that, and I think we also came to believe that there is a distinction between a company's set of values, right? And in JP Morgan's case and many other companies, they express those values in their annual reporting and annual CEO letters. So there's some substance there, and overtly stepping into politics, right? And Jamie talked about not being weaponized by forces sort of on either side. So maybe that's a framework for it. I mean, I think that there is clearly a role for government, in particular in partnership with business, right? And so I think one of the things that we talk about a lot in the book is this idea of coalition building. Oftentimes, the best outcomes for our economy come from partnerships between government and business, where business ultimately then sort of carries it on, right? And so there is a role. Certainly, there's a role for government, and government alone in for example helping fund some core research, which I think is unrealistic to expect companies themselves to fund. And I think one of the things we get concerned about sort of today's political environment is we seem to be pulling away from some of that. But this idea of beyond that, companies and government coming together like that we think makes a lot more sense. So it's not a great answer to your question, because I think we're not totally clear on exactly the right role for businesses, but acknowledging that businesses hold a huge amount of power in our economy and in our society is the first step, right? Like let's acknowledge we have a problem, if that's how the lens to think of it through, but acknowledge that this is what's happening, and be open-eyed to how much influence that these business leaders are exerting. And it should be pretty obvious to anyone in 2025, 2026, that we're seeing that sort of all over the place, right? This connection between government and industry leaders has never been stronger, but maybe more fraught with conflict.
Mm. I would just build on that a little bit by saying, first of all, to recognize that business leaders themselves, at least the responsible, smart ones, and there are, do exist, right? I mean, one of the things that has developed as we've been talking about the book is the extent to which people think business is the bad guy, especially in the left and especially among young people, right? So they can't even wrap their minds around the idea that business leaders, in fact, don't want to live in this world where they have ultimate responsibility for all these questions, where we're creating a world where there are billionaires and really poor people, right? That obviously, right, there are many business leaders who are responsible and who are acting to try and build a new path forward. So recognizing that, figuring out who you can work with. And so that's one thing. And then there are some interesting ideas, right, for building a new kinds of accountability structures into the system. I mean, certainly, like people have talked for a long time about shareholders becoming more of a force. Consumers are a force. So elevating those parts of society. I've always thought that like professional associations or professional licensing, not potential, not licensing, not state regulation, because I think it hampers business creation. But when, you know, the way doctors get licensed today, right? Those organizations are pretty powerful and can be, I think, a counterweight to some of the power of corporations.
And what's interesting to think about, actually, Elizabeth, is, and I don't know if these are effective yet or not, but if you think about, so AI obviously is sort of what everyone's talking about in business, and really two of the most powerful companies in AI, Anthropic and OpenAI, are actually governed by trusts, right? Where, and I think that's a recognition that we can't only rely on the beneficence of CEOs or their boards of directors to maybe make the right decision, especially around things that are as consequential as AI. And so very early days in what that looks like, but I think that's another area that is really interesting to explore. So I would point that out as well as sort of another example of a sort of changing governance, which is what you're really describing.
Well, and I think one of the things that is so fascinating about this current moment and what we're talking about, which is the transference of power away from government and toward business in our current economy. Having grown up at the time I grown up, you can see it, the influence and the prevalence of business leaders and businesses and the power that they have. And at the same time, here we are at the end of 2025, and President Trump, like no other president before him has, or at least in modern years, has really gone after business leaders who have not been on his side, have made them pay consequences, have really tried to push the hand and force the hand of corporations and what they do and what they invest in with quite a degree of success. Like I have been sort of dismayed actually by how easily values related to diversity, equity, and inclusion have been completely abandoned by a corporate America that just 5 years ago was championing it as its biggest initiative and biggest priority. And so I think that our current moment is actually a little bit of a case study in the opposite, in that government and leader who chooses not to be benevolent can really exercise a great deal of authority. And so I'm curious as to what this current moment sort of tells you about everything we're talking about the power of business in our current economy.
Oh, this is now we're really getting into the meat of it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit on the idea that corporate America has abandoned DEI,
Great.
because this goes to our conversation we're having before the podcast, right? But our information environment is clearly broken. And so I think that there's a lot happening in the information environment, in the news media, that doesn't really accurately reflect reality, because it's in the incentive on both sides of our very divided system for the news media to say, oh, look, Donald Trump has been successful in getting this company to abandon its DEI pledge. And on the other side, there's an incentive for the left to say, oh, yes, this company has abandoned their DEI pledge, right? Because they think companies are bad and they have fear drives dollars, right? So that is happening on one aspect. The other thing is that I think businesses are fundamentally pretty pragmatic, right? I think there are some who probably were just paying lip service to DEI and they've just abandoned it. But the truth is, and businesses know this, that actually diversity is good business practice. If you look at the economic reality, um, a ton of the growth that has come in the last 50 years came from the better allocation of talent. So when we are throwing up artificial barriers in front of people who are of a different class, of a different race, of a different gender, we're actually hampering the success of an individual business and our economic growth. Business leaders know that actually probably much better than people in government or people who haven't run a business, right? So I do not think that they are abandoning DEI wholesale. I think they're going quiet about it because why risk the wrath, right?
Mm-hmm. And the terms have been weaponized, right? And Elizabeth had a chance to interview Larry Fink as part of our research, and he used that term very specifically. He said, I'm no longer going to use, the DEI, ESG terminology because they've been weaponized. But if you actually look at what he's doing as the leader of BlackRock, and we can talk about the concentration of power there and in the finance world separately, but if you look at what he's doing, they're not abandoning sort of the core principles that they had been expounding, 5 years ago, whatever. So I clearly there's been a little bit of a pullback, but I think a lot of that is around language more than it is around actual action, and they're just operating without, and maybe that's not so bad, right? Before, every company was, signing up to some DEI or ESG pledge, and a lot of that kind of felt like greenwashing or sort of in just marketing, if you will. And now they're just quietly doing the actual work behind the scenes. So, look, Trump is a very curious figure as you think about this transition, right? So in our worldview, neoliberalism kind of ended in the late teens, and now we're just in this messy, we don't really know what's happening. And Trump talks almost like a dynamic capitalist, right? He talks a lot about why worker empowerment is important, why we need to bring jobs back to the United States, why we need to bring manufacturing back to the United States, et cetera. So he speaks about that a lot. But he also governs more like a neoliberal, right? He seems to espouse more of those actual principles in his operating. And I think that's just a good example of exactly where we are in society right now, which is somewhat confused about what we should do. And obviously Trump has a view of power that's maybe different than, at least differently expressed than prior presidents, and he's just not gonna govern in any sort of balanced fashion with Congress. He's just gonna do what he wants to do. And we actually pointed out some challenges with this in an op-ed recently in the New York Times. But that's his the instantiation of what he thinks power looks like, and I think that's what we're seeing. And so I'm not not excusing that, by the way. I think it's terrible for our economy, and crony capitalism, which is kind of what he's practicing, is not a very good way to create a stable economy. But I think that's what we see going on, and I hope that the people who are listening to this podcast, especially those who are in government or a government adjacent, continue to do their jobs, because government, even in its sort of slightly different role in this new economy, still has a really important role to play.
Mm. I want to come back to something you said, Elizabeth, about information, and information being not necessarily an accurate representation of what's going on. Before we do that, though, let's take a quick ad break and then we'll come straight back. It's such a tough time for nonprofits, agencies, and changemakers. Funding is tight, capacity is stretched, and your work matters more than ever. And you need communication support that can keep up. That's why we are super excited to introduce our new suite of modular, flexible services, built to help you and your storytelling stay visible, resilient, and connected when it matters the most. Whether you need a quick messaging refresh or adaptable on-demand support, Javelina is here to help you move forward with clarity and strength. You can see this list of services and discounted prices at javelina.co/rapid-response-services. That's javelina.co/rapid-response-services. Okay, so Elizabeth, you had said prior to the break that the information in the media and sort of out there in the world is not always an accurate representation of actually what's going on. And I completely believe that to be true. I think that one of the things I talk about over and over and over and over and over with my clients and with my community is this pervasive narrative that the whole world is doomed is not really an accurate representation of what's going on. And why do I know this? Because every single day I am blessed to work with these incredible clients who are fundamentally shaping lives and communities and seeing incredible results. And so I know that for a lot of different reasons that we won't get into, there's this very successful pervasive narrative that everything's doomed, and then sort of the on the ground locally based community reality that tells a very different story, but that story doesn't get told, which is really why this podcast exists. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, story by story, I want to share those. And so can you talk a little bit about the role of information in perhaps in the capitalist economy that we're emerging out of, and then into this new capitalist economy that we're going into? What is the role of information? How is it different? And how should we think about it?
Yeah, this is like one of the things I love to think and talk about, right? I've been a business journalist or a financial journalist. It's funny, I was a business journalist for like 20 years, and then people started calling me a financial journalist, which I guess was a promotion. But I've been right. It's just like as in my career, I've gotten closer and closer to the real levers of power, which are in finance. So what I would say is that two things. One is that obviously social media has done a number on our information environment, but I feel like your listeners are going to be well familiar, both in their own lives and in the many articles and research, all the research that's been done, right? Completely agree with that. And that is one reason that I think we have to be very careful with AI, right? Because Silicon Valley has not really demonstrated a good approach to self-governance. So I would say that a new observation for some people is about journalism itself, and to understand that journalism as a profession grew up in the post-World War II era in the United States. And that was an era in which government was the solution to every problem, because it was, right? Government was very functional at the time, in part because it was in coalitions with businesses. We were doing a lot of building. It was the golden age of capitalism. And that's when journalism as a profession hardened, right? It's got its identity there. And then under the neoliberal approach, government was still the main actor. It was just the enemy in sort of like this emerging narrative that was going on, right? So, but in both cases, and wherever you were on the journalistic spectrum, government was the main actor, either the hero or the enemy of the story. And what we've seen in the past, decade or two with the rise of Fox News is government is the enemy. And you've seen this reaction of the older mainstream establishment, journalism establishment saying government is the hero. And then all that business sort of got pushed to the side or framed in relation to government. The hopeful sign I see right now, so one of the things that's happening is that because of that overall narrative about the role of government in relation to business, is that many of the media on both sides have missed the rise of business as the main actor in society. They don't understand the way the business world works. They don't cover it well. Reading an annual report is not something that most of the journalists I know would even remotely know how to do. And in journalism, the higher profile jobs always went to the people covering government and politics. Right? So that is why our information environment looks like it does today. The main discourse has been around government and politics. And now we're shifting to business. There are actually some entities, including Report for America, that are making a concerted attempt. ProPublica is another organization that do have kind of the chops, the business and financial chops, to better dissect and hold business leaders accountable for their actions.
And Elizabeth, when we were chatting prior to the recording, you had said, there are a couple of things that I feel hopeful for in the future when it comes to information. I'm curious what those things are because I think we all need it.
I know, right? Okay, here's the most hopeful thing recently. I was down visiting my daughter Lily, who's in South Carolina, going to the University of South Carolina. And I went to a coffee shop and walked in. And as I was waiting in line, I looked around. It was packed with people, young people, all in their early 20s or late teens. Not a single one of them was on their phone.
Mm.
And I thought, you know what? Okay, these kids are smarter. Like, we're all so worried. We're also worried that, we gave them their phones too young. It messed up their critical thinking skills. They're all addicted. The world's going to hell. But we also did a good job raising them in a lot of ways, right? And I do think that they have figured out they're not that happy if they're looking at TikTok all day long and they're starting to put their phones down. So I find that that was a very hopeful, like from the ground moment for me. And the other thing that gives me hope is this trend I'm seeing in the media. People are reconfiguring themselves to do a better job covering this new world, what's left of the media. And there are also a lot of funders stepping forward to try and rebuild the journalism community. So those things make me hopeful.
People
Well,
create real experiences, right? I mean, we're
yeah.
seeing the rise in sort of in real life activities and in real life, like people trying to like not collect things but collect experiences. And I think that that's particularly true, Elizabeth, to your point, amongst sort of younger people who have recognized, they grew up attached to their phones. If you're in your early 20s or late teens, you also sort of had COVID hit at a very formative time in your life, and you missed the ability to be in community with people. And I've definitely noticed the same thing, both just broadly, but even with my own kids who are in that age range, where they want to spend more time actually hanging out with their friends, and when they do that, their phones aren't out.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that's hopeful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think too, I spend a lot of time thinking about researching, projecting change. And one of the things that strikes me all the time is that it is very easy to put words and numbers around what you're losing, and very difficult to put words and numbers around what you're gaining.
Mhm.
And I think that there are things, anytime that there's a changing landscape, there's reasons for that. And there are things that are being gained that are just very, very difficult to articulate and even to notice. And then you layer on top of that the negativity bias of the human brain and the business model of the media.
Mhm.
And it can be a bit of a doomsday story. But I also feel hopeful because I actually think that the democratization of information, there are really good things about that, that there are less gatekeepers. And I think that there are also downsides to that too. Um, it's not all, not one size fits all, but reasons
You know,
to be hopeful.
if I'll just add one thing since we're digging into this topic a little bit, but I feel like we're all three of us are thoughtful about it. And the so I was hanging out with Ted Koppel once in Armenia, of all places. But
Of
we were
course.
at a right,
As one does, yeah.
Yeah, like you do.
we were at a conference, a humanitarian conference, and I was being very aggressive and I like pigeonholed him, right? Because I mean, he was one of my journalistic heroes. And so I asked him about this change in the media landscape. And he said something I think that was simple but very interesting, which was that he thought one of the reasons that we were at a bad place is that we had lost kind of this group of powerful media outlets. In other words, he thought we functioned best when there were maybe like a dozen big dominant voices in the US. And you could argue about is it the best number 15 or 20 or whatever it should be, but we've gone down to, I mean, the New York Times and Fox. But like what have we gone down to, right? There's just
Right.
very, very few of them. So they're not enough to themselves create a rich conversation. At the same time, we've lost the local media landscape. And so I think both of those things are part of the story, and it would be a good idea or initiative, and I'm sure some people are doing it, but to try and rebuild both of those landscapes at the same time, and in conjunction with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. One of the things that has maybe not replaced is not the right word, but come into addition to a local media landscape is individuals or small groups of people who are essentially doing direct to consumer journalism, really in the form of newsletters and Substack. And that I think is rich and additive and gets really overlooked when people talk about local media having gone away. I think it's really shifted. I think it's in some ways better, some ways worse, but it's not completely a loss.
And like most things, right, the thing that is the best is also its Achilles heel, right? Like,
Well,
so
right.
the idea of empowering individuals to be on the ground and reporting things that are happening. We've seen so many examples through the Arab Spring and other places where individuals are empowered, I like that word, to report what's actually going on. And but like everything, like it's, the superpower is its greatest weakness as well. And the weakness is you can't always trust everything that comes out, and there are people that have a very specific agenda that they try to promote in the exact same way. And I think what's hard right now in the landscape as just a consumer of media is cutting through, not just cutting through the noise, but cutting through to what is actually real and not real. And AI will probably exacerbate that. And
Yeah.
we'll have to come up with some new, either new rules around that or new ways of discerning. And one of the things we actually say this very explicitly in the book is the media landscape is not, we're not going to pull it back together and have three main news networks and then a couple of sort of papers of record and then this robust but very professionalized local landscape of newspapers and local TV. Like, it's not going to come all back together. So we're going to have to figure out as consumers of information how to navigate an environment that's much more fractious. And on the positive side, there's a million Substacks out there, and so you can get information on all sorts of things that you might be interested in. Obviously, on the negative side, you got to be cautious about what you believe.
Right. So when we're talking about reconfiguration, I want to ask you about how things are evolving in business leaders and businesses and their relationship to politics. So in the past, there's always been this kind of old adage that I think is dying if it's not already dead, that if businesses stay away from politics, you have to appeal to everybody, it's only a net loss if you end up sort of picking a side or whatever. And in this new emerging economy of business being the biggest actor, I'm curious how that is changing, what the forces are behind that change and what it looks like.
One of the questions that we ask in the book is, where is that line, right? I referenced it earlier. And I think that one of our conclusions is that businesses stepped over the line too much. There was a moment in time where it felt like businesses were commenting on everything, right? And that felt like a bit much. And we asked the question, I mean, do we really want to live in a society where sort of every business that gets associated with being, let's say, red or blue,
Right.
just to sort of simplify it, but and I think about it a lot. I drive a pickup truck from time to time because we have a farm and some animals, and I've got to go get hay. And I do sometimes feel very self-conscious about, like, what do other people driving by me think of me driving in rural Colorado in my F-150? And I don't like that. I don't want to be defined by that. And in the same way that I don't necessarily want to be defined if I'm wearing my Patagonia vest. I'm in finance, everyone has one, so I have to. But like, I also don't want to be defined by that either, right? And I think that we really push hard on this question, and the conclusion that we come to, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, but I'll say it a bit more directly in response to this question, is the idea of companies saying, hey, we have a bunch of values and we care about those values, to us makes, like, that's where we think the line is, versus sort of jumping all the way into politics. And there are some particularly private companies that have really jumped into politics. Think about Hobby Lobby on the right side of the political spectrum, and Patagonia, back to my vest, on the left side, where they've literally, in both cases, sued the government. I think that's unrealistic to expect of other businesses, and it's a mess when other businesses get into that. We tell the story of Disney and sort of what happened with them in Florida, and why they had jumped into this debate about a local to Florida bill that affected people from the LGBTQ plus community. But they jumped into it in a way that was politics first, not values first. And it got completely weaponized by then Governor Ron DeSantis, and it kind of blew up, right? Ultimately ended up in the CEO got fired over it. And we use that as an example of like, I don't, at least we don't think that that's what companies should be asked to do. So we would love to see companies sort of pull back to the side of the line that is, hey, these are the things we care about. These are the values we care about. It's funny. I've thought about this. I don't think I've ever said this to you, but I've thought about this a little bit in the context of my college. I'm a trustee of my college, and we're constantly being asked by students to make a proclamation about whatever this thing that's going on in the world, right? And often we have a very clear view, at least amongst the board, about what is right and what is wrong. But we've made a very deliberate decision not to jump in on this stuff, right? What we've decided is we will only talk about things that affect our mission and our students directly. And I think that that's maybe illustrative, because I think that there was a temptation when you get asked about some conflict zone or something like that to be like, well, yeah, of course, there's a very clear right or wrong here, and we should jump in on that. But we very quickly realized that we're going to be asked to do that every day on something somewhere. And every time we say something about one thing, there's like 5 other things that we didn't comment on that are kind of very similar that we probably should have commented on if we're going to comment on the one thing. And I would just use that maybe as a bit of an analogy to sort of what we would say to companies, which is, look, if it affects your business very directly, then yes, you can speak about it. But still, ideally through a values lens, not a politics lens. So, does that summarize sort of how we wrote about it and how we're thinking about it? And again, the book does a better job probably of walking through that. So hopefully people's interest is piqued and they'll go buy the book to read the whole thing.
And the other thing I would say is that neoliberal capitalism, Milton Friedman's, responsibilities of a company and a shareholder actually gave companies like clear guidelines, right? So that they could say to everything, that's not our business. Our only business is delivering value to shareholders. We argue in the book it was too far to you removed yourself from all of your responsibility to develop a healthy society in doing that. So what we're seeing now is this pendulum swing back. I mean, it's like the US always does this, right? We're here and then we go here. It is what our model does. Where it swung was like, okay, businesses is responsible for everything. And now we're hoping that it swings back to the middle. I think the middle is going to require not laws. That's what were adopted under neoliberal capitalism in terms of shareholder primacy, but guidelines maybe. And you can see that at the Business Roundtable, they could be local, right? Businesses do need support for how they are particularly making these complicated decisions. So I hope that will arise as some of the new institutions that we need.
So you had said earlier that the dynamic capitalism that you lay out in the book is, it's not, like you said, it's not a guarantee that this is going to happen, but this is your sort of best projection. And so let's say that it does. Let's say that the fundamentals that you talk about in the book sort of largely, more or less, play out as predicted. If we look ahead 10 years, as that evolution unfolds, what will American life look like?
Wow, that's a great.
No pressure.
It's a fun question, because if you're optimistic, it's fun, right? I mean, I really hope that a longer term orientation can take hold. I think there are a lot of signs that people are thinking in that direction. And it's probably partly a reflection of AI and better data, right? We can now forecast, we can now see the trends. If you're responsible and if we can stick to the science, then you can see what the consequences of actions are. And so I do hope that we will be in a kind of period of major restoration of the environment, which I think we need. So that'll be my prediction.
I think it's going to be, US is sort of designed to be fractious and messy. And so I want to be careful in answering this question that, I don't see some sort of like utopic, AI and everyone's like sitting on the beach kind of world. I think that we will constantly be debating and arguing about these sorts of ideas. My hope is that, as Elizabeth described, we tend to swing from one side of the pendulum to the other. And I feel like we've had a bit of whiplash recently, right? You go from Trump to Biden to Trump from a sort of top politics level. Like oh my God, there's a lot going on, right? And so sometimes we just need to take a step back and breathe. But I do believe that we will empower more of an ownership economy. There will be more capitalists. I hope there will be far more people that feel like they have a stake in our economy. I hope we will have reduced overall government control and regulation on so many aspects of our lives that are preventing many people and entrepreneurs from starting businesses, moving their businesses, building more housing, right? All of the things that maybe we talk about in the abundance agenda, just to put a quick and overly simplistic label on it. So I hope we'll have nudged it in the right direction, and then yet want to acknowledge we're still going to have all sorts of problems. There will be income inequality, there'll be opportunity inequality, all of that exists, but I hope that it'll be better, right? And when I think about American dynamism, the American dream, the ability of people to sort of move up their station in life, I don't know that people recognize just how much we've actually moved away from that. I mean, 30 years ago, if you were born in the bottom 25th percentile of wealth, you had a 25% chance of dying in the top 25th percentile. Now you have a 5% chance of dying in the top 5th percentile. That is horrible for our economy, because we are not taking advantage of all of this great talent that we have, right? I mean, that's just, to me, that's a perversion of capitalism, because we actually aren't empowering and enabling people to sort of make the best of themselves. And one of the areas in AI that I'm actually most interested in, maybe most optimistic about, is in our education system, right? I mean, I think that part of the reason that meritocracy has gone away from the United States, and this ability, to move up in your station in life, is because education has become increasingly unequal, mostly because of the way we fund it. And I'm hopeful that there's an opportunity through AI, and it will take some change to the system, and I know that that'll be hard, but there are people working on this that will enable better learning and more individualized learning that will help equal that playing field. So you will be less reliant on the zip code that you live in being the predictor of whether you have an opportunity to have a great education or not. So, and to me, fundamentally, that is what will help, over certainly a longer period of time, promote this kind of dynamism that we're talking about. So optimistic, but also cautious that it's going to always be messy.
Well, that would be a really significant change in the course of human history if there was more equity among where you live related to the outcomes that you are afforded. That would be a fundamental shift. So that's something I can certainly believe in.
I mean, it has happened before, right? In the period after World War II, we were living, not for everyone, but our economy was doing a better job at distributing opportunity. And I'm sure if we look back through history, we could find other examples of that.
And important to say, Elizabeth, our economy was growing faster, right? On an absolute basis. So we talk about sort of, equity being more distributed during that time, but also it resulted in a faster growing overall economy as measured by GDP.
Yeah. So let's wrap up with some really quick speed round questions. Let's start off with, for the first question, let's start with you, Elizabeth. What is a great book that has informed your change making?
A great book that has informed my change making. Actually, I would say Middlemarch. Middlemarch is by George Eliot, and it's a book about normal people, regular people, common people, the middle class, doing the right thing on a day-by-day basis. And the end of the book has a great quote that says something like, if we could but recognize the contributions of all the people lying in unknown tombs across the world, we would recognize the greatness of humanity.
Seth, how about you?
I was going to go in a totally different direction. My wife's going to laugh at me because she owns a bookstore and I'm constantly selling this book. But sometimes you just need to take a step back. We've read so many books about capitalism and change and from the right and the left, whatever. And it just sometimes is overwhelming. And I recently read one of the best books I've read in a really long time, fiction book, work of fiction by a Colorado author named Shelley Reed called Go as a River. And it was, my only wish about the book is that I could read it again for the first time. It was so lovely. And so sometimes I feel like you just need to step outside of the here I've got a really long Audible and actually Libro FM is my platform of choice, but I've got a really long list of books that I'm listening to. I've got books piled up on my bedside table, and sometimes you just need to like stop and try something a little bit different. So go as a river.
100%. I will check it out.
It's so long.
So let's start with Seth this time. Who is one change maker that inspires you?
I would point to Andrew Kassoy. Andrew was one of the founders of the B Corp movement. We were fortunate enough to speak to him really at length about his experiences. He passed away quite young. He was in his maybe mid 50s, mid to late 50s, passed away last year. And, really he embodies, I think, a lot of the values that have informed my own thinking about the role of business and the role of business and change. He came from a sort of a private equity background. Maybe that's why I'm picking him, because he's got some similarities in terms of his kind of his day job title. But he also really drove change in a meaningful way through his work at B Corp.
Mm.
And I would say Lisa Green Hall, someone else we interview in the book, who was uh, a early CEO of Calvert Impact Capital, did a great job there, ended up kind of rising through the impact investment ranks and was working at Apollo Global when she also died. So we interviewed three people who in the book who passed away before the book was published. So it has a lot of good wisdom in it from those leaders. But Lisa really taught me that human beings, that business people are human beings, first of all, and you have to approach them from that lens.
Mm. And Seth, let's start with you again. What's a daily habit that keeps you grounded?
I would say that it is working out.
Good for you.
I make time. It was either going to be that or doing the Wordle, which I do every day. Because I need some me time, right? I mean, it's so easy. I mean, one of the other things I don't do is I don't check email first thing in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
I try to like ease into my day, and the way I ease into my day is I work out almost every day and I do the Wordle every day. So I think those are the things that just sort of like give me a moment. There's a moment while I'm doing the Wordle because I get stuck somewhere where I just sort of stop and I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna just sit and breathe for 5 minutes and drink my coffee and then come back to it.
I love it. Elizabeth?
Mine is I have a window that looks out onto my backyard, and every morning that I can, I come and stand at that window. I have some books that sit to the side, some books of poetry, some books of quotes and meditations, and that's where I do my centering every day.
And then Elizabeth, if you had to describe change making in one word, what would it be?
Hard.
Sure is. Seth?
I interpreted this question slightly differently, which is one word piece of advice I would give to both myself and changemakers. It's patience. I strongly believe that the long arc of history bends toward justice, as MLK said. I really do believe that. And I think in any given moment, it can be so easy to feel defeated. And I have felt that way many times over the last, I don't know, 6 or 8 years now in particular, but patience.
Yeah, I love that. And then how can listeners best connect with you both and support the book?
Well, we have a website, thecapitalevolution.com, but definitely right now it would be buying the book. That would be the best way to connect with us. Buy it, read it, and reach out.
Please do. And I would say a couple things. One, it's like, I mean, you can buy it on Amazon, Books a Million, and Barnes and Noble, but if you have a local bookstore, buy it there. We will actually be at Politics and Prose on January 17th. And Wonderland Books also in the DC area. So we'd love to see people there. And that's a great way to connect with us directly. And then you can find me also at sethlevine.com. My email, other contact information is there.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. This has been really enlightening and interesting. And I think, when we're talking about the economy that we live in, we're talking about the world that we live in and how it's changing. And I've loved reflecting on this current moment and sort of imagining what might be to come. So thank you guys both so very much for your time and for your work. Wasn't that an incredible conversation? I think the thing that stood out to me the most, and I'm going to be noodling this for days to come, I know, is The world is changing. The world is changing, and there is absolutely nothing that you can do to stop it, slow it down, reverse it. And what really jumped out to me from my conversation with Elizabeth and Seth is that our entire economy is shifting, and we are moving into this new version, this evolved version of capitalism, kind of whether we like it or not, in which businesses play a much greater role. And so that brings up some really important questions about accountability, about power, about values, about equity, about inclusion. And these are some of the things that we must grapple with. I think as change makers, it can be very easy to dismiss the role of government. And I think sometimes when we think about big business, we think about very well-known people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. But those are three people in an ecosystem of many, many more that are shaping our economies. So thinking about the businesses that exist in our communities and the role they are playing in shaping our communities and how we are interacting with them, how we're collaborating with them, how we're supporting them, how we are holding them accountable, how we're pushing them. There's a lot of opportunity for people working in social change to think, really think deeply about the businesses that they are working with and how you can do that to mutually drive your own goals and their goals as well. So I am so incredibly grateful to Elizabeth and Seth. The book is out now, The Capital Evolution. You can get it from wherever books are sold. And until next time, when I cannot wait to share another story of change with you, I hope you have a great one.